The galaxy's most elite warriors, beings who could personally dismantle Star Destroyers with their bare appendages, sitting in stunned silence as a human logistics coordinator calmly redistributes trail mix and somehow becomes the commanding officer of their entire operation. While they spent decades mastering 17 different forms of combat, she mastered the infinitely more dangerous art of keeping everyone fed, hydrated, and psychologically stable enough to actually think straight. Before we continue the story, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to HFY Havoc, hit the bell, and like this video. Because if you want more epic HFY sci-fi stories like this one, you don't want to miss out. What you're about to witness is the most devastating military maneuver in galactic history. Competent administration in the face of cosmic-level incompetence. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never look at a granola bar the same way again. The briefing room smelled like ozone and disappointment, which was fairly standard for military installations across the galaxy. What wasn't standard was the human sitting at the conference table, methodically arranging small packets of something called trail mix into neat rows, while 7 of the most lethal beings in known space stared at her with expressions ranging from bewilderment to outright hostility. Commander Vex Thul of the Chronari Death Squads flexed his 4 arms in what his species considered a polite gesture of restraint. His voice carried the gravelly undertone of someone who had personally strangled a moon. Explain to me again why we need a logistics coordinator for a stealth infiltration mission. The human looked up from her snack arrangement, blinking owlishly through thick-rimmed glasses. Oh, you don't need a logistics coordinator. You need someone who remembers that you get cranky when your blood sugar drops. She held up a packet. Mixed nuts, dried fruit, and chocolate. The chocolate's important for morale. Fleet Admiral Zarketh, whose crystalline exoskeleton had survived 3 galactic wars, made a sound like grinding diamonds. We are elite warriors. We do not require... What did she call it? Trail mix, supplied Lieutenant Korvash, the hegemony's premier infiltration specialist. Her 6 eyes rotated independently, a nervous tick that betrayed her confusion. I've run psychological profiles on 17 different species. This makes no strategic sense. The human smiled with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to particularly slow children. That's because you're overthinking it. When was the last time any of you ate? Silence settled over the room like a tactical blanket. The elite soldiers exchanged glances that could have powered small starships. We consumed our regulation nutrient supplements at 0600 hours, Captain Mordek announced, his beetle-like mandibles clicking with precision. The Sector Marine Corps didn't produce soldiers who forgot their feeding schedules. Right. And it's now... The human checked a device on her wrist that looked suspiciously primitive compared to the holographic displays surrounding them. 1430. That's 8.5 hours. On Earth, we call that way too long between meals. General Thisara, whose reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by her species' legendary capacity for violence, leaned forward on her serpentine coils. Your planet's feeding requirements are irrelevant to this operation. Are they? The human began opening packets, filling the air with scents that somehow made the sterile atmosphere seem less oppressive. Because this mission brief says you've had 47 previous attempts to crack this fortress, 47 failures, and every single one involved highly trained, perfectly disciplined soldiers who followed protocol to the letter. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Discussing tactical failures was generally considered poor etiquette among beings who could level cities with their bare appendages. Commander Vex Thul's primary eyes narrowed to slits. Those failures resulted from inadequate intelligence regarding the fortress's psychological defenses. We have since adapted our approach. Have you? The human distributed small bowls, each filled with her mysterious snack mixture. Or did you just bring more of the same highly trained, perfectly disciplined soldiers and hope they'd somehow react differently to whatever made the previous teams lose their minds? The current strike team represents the pinnacle of military evolution, Lieutenant Korvash interjected, her voice carrying the subtle harmonics that indicated wounded pride. I personally spent 15 years mastering the Keth-Moran invisibility disciplines. Captain Mordek survived the siege of Proxima Void. General Thisara once held an entire star system with nothing but tactical brilliance and 3 destroyers. The human nodded appreciatively, while crunching on something that looked like a small brown pebble. Impressive, really. And I brought snacks. She paused, considering. Guess we'll see which approach works better. Fleet Admiral Zarketh's crystalline structure flared with bioluminescent patterns that translated roughly to extreme irritation. This creature mocks us. No, said the human, surprisingly gently. I'm trying to keep you alive. There's a difference. The briefing room's main display activated, showing a 3-dimensional model of their target. Fortress Keth-Mora, a structure that had stood unconquered for 3 millennia. Its black walls seemed to absorb light even in holographic form. 47 attempts, the human repeated, studying the display while absently offering her bowl to Captain Mordek, who accepted it with the reflexive politeness of a career soldier. What did they all have in common? Failure, General Thisara replied with acid precision. Besides that, the human gestured at the fortress model. They all involved military personnel, trained killers, beings who spent decades learning to suppress fear, ignore pain, follow orders without question. She looked around the table. Tell me, when you're infiltrating enemy territory, what's the first rule? Maintain operational security, Commander Vexthul responded automatically. Stay invisible, added Lieutenant Korvash. Trust your training, Captain Mordek contributed through a mouthful of trail mix. The human smiled. Wrong, wrong, and wrong. The first rule is don't die stupidly. She reached into her duffel bag and produced more packets. These are energy bars, 17 different flavors, all designed to provide sustained nutrition without causing digestive distress. I also have electrolyte tablets, caffeine supplements, and something called comfort chocolate that my species developed specifically for high-stress situations. The elite soldiers stared at her provisions with the fascination typically reserved for alien artifacts. Your intelligence brief mentions that previous teams experienced rapid psychological deterioration, the human continued conversationally. Panic attacks, paranoid episodes, complete mental breakdowns, classic symptoms of severe stress combined with nutritional deficiency. Fleet Admiral Zarketh's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what might have been grudging interest. You believe inadequate sustenance contributed to the mission failures? I believe that hungry, tired, stressed soldiers make poor decisions. And when those poor decisions happen inside a fortress specifically designed to exploit psychological weaknesses. She shrugged. Well, you've seen the results 47 times. General Thisara's coils tightened in what her species used as a gesture of concentration. You propose that proper nutrition will somehow counteract 3 millennia of defensive evolution. I propose that proper nutrition might help you think clearly enough to figure out what those defenses actually are. The human began packing her supplies back into the duffel bag with efficient movements. Your previous teams went in expecting a fight. Maybe the fortress gave them exactly what they expected. The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of several elite warriors cautiously sampling Earth snacks. Commander Vexthul eventually cleared his throat, a sound like grinding machinery. "The mission launches in 6 hours," he announced. "Final equipment checks at 0400. The human nodded and stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder with practiced ease. "I'll be ready. Try to get some sleep, all of you. And maybe eat something that isn't a regulation nutrient paste." She paused at the door. "Oh, and Commander, you might want to pack extra socks. Nothing ruins infiltration quite like wet feet." She left them sitting in stunned silence, staring at empty snack bowls and questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. Outside in the corridor, the human allowed herself a small smile. Phase 1, complete. Establish the baseline of their expectations. Phase 2 would begin when they realized that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the assumption that strength looked like what they expected it to look like. The interior of Fortress Kethemora defied every principle of defensive architecture that had been developed across 3,000 years of galactic warfare. Instead of narrow corridors designed for choke points, the passages were wide and oddly welcoming. Rather than harsh lighting intended to disorient intruders, a soft, phosphorescent glow emanated from walls that seemed almost organic in their gentle curves. "This makes no strategic sense," Captain Mordek muttered, his targeting systems cycling through threat assessments that kept returning null results. "Where are the automated turrets? The pressure plates? The neural gas dispensers?" The human paused at an intersection where 5 corridors branched off like the fingers of a massive hand. She consulted what appeared to be a hand-drawn map on actual paper, a material so primitive that most of the team had only seen it in archaeological exhibits. "Maybe they never needed them," she suggested, folding the map with practiced efficiency. "Left passage, by the way. The others lead to dead ends." General Thisara's serpentine form coiled with barely restrained tension. "How could you possibly know that?" I asked. The human gestured toward a section of wall that looked identical to every other section they had passed. "The architecture here is responsive. It's been trying to communicate with us since we entered." Lieutenant Korvash's 6 eyes performed their independent scanning routine, analyzing everything from electromagnetic signatures to quantum fluctuations. "My sensors detect no artificial intelligence systems, no communication networks." "That's because you're looking for technology." The human began walking down the left corridor, her footsteps echoing with surprising resonance. "This place isn't technological, it's psychological." They followed her deeper into the fortress, past chambers filled with crystalline formations that hummed with frequencies just below the threshold of hearing. Commander Vexthul kept his 4 arms positioned for instant weapon deployment, though he was beginning to suspect that conventional warfare had no application here. "Psychological architecture," Fleet Admiral Zarketh's voice crackled through their comm systems, transmitted from the orbiting command ship. "Theoretical frameworks suggest buildings designed to influence mental states, rather than provide physical defense." "Not theoretical," the human corrected, pausing beside what looked like a fountain filled with liquid light. "Just uncommon. My planet has several cultures that developed similar concepts. Buildings that make you feel calm, spaces that encourage creativity, rooms designed to promote healing. And rooms designed to drive intruders insane," General Thisara added grimly. "Exactly. Though I'm starting to think that wasn't the original purpose." The human knelt beside the fountain and dipped her fingers into the luminous fluid. It clung to her skin like benevolent mercury, casting rainbow patterns across her plain features. "This feels more like screening." The corridor ahead split again, but this time the architectural choices were impossible to ignore. The left path descended into darkness so complete that it seemed to absorb their artificial lighting. The right path climbed toward a warm, golden glow that somehow made the air itself feel comforting. The center passage remained neutral, continuing forward with the same phosphorescent guidance they had been following. Standard tactical doctrine suggests taking the middle path, Captain Mordek announced. Avoid obvious traps while maintaining forward momentum. Standard tactical doctrine got 47 teams killed, the human pointed out gently. She was studying the 3 passages with the focused attention of someone solving a puzzle rather than planning an assault. Besides, I don't think these are traps. I think they're questions. Lieutenant Korvash's optical enhancements cycled through multiple spectrums, searching for hidden threats or concealed mechanisms. What kind of questions? The kind that reveal who you really are when nobody's watching. The human approached the dark passage, close enough that the shadows seemed to reach for her with tendrils of absolute blackness. This one asks if you're brave enough to face your fears. The bright one asks if you're wise enough to resist temptation. The middle one asks if you're practical enough to avoid making unnecessary choices. Commander Vex Thul's primary weapons systems activated with soft mechanical sounds. And which path should we take? The human smiled with genuine amusement. All of them? Before anyone could protest or question the logistics of her suggestion, she stepped directly into the darkness. For a moment, her form was visible as a silhouette against the impossible blackness. Then the shadow swallowed her completely, and she was gone. Contact lost, General Tessera reported, with the clipped precision of someone trying to maintain professional composure while witnessing something that violated basic physics. No energy signature, no thermal trace. She just disappeared. The dark passage began to shift, its absolute blackness resolving into shapes and forms that each team member recognized with growing horror. Captain Mordek saw the chittering swarms that had devoured his homeworld's colonies. Lieutenant Korvash watched her own reflection multiply into dozens of failed versions of herself. Commander Vex Thul faced an endless corridor lined with the corpses of everyone he had failed to protect. But from somewhere in the darkness came the sound of unwrapping plastic and a cheerfully conversational voice. "Oh, this is clever. It's not actually showing you what you're afraid of. It's showing you what you think you should be afraid of. Completely different thing." General Tessera slithered towards the entrance of the dark passage, her coils moving with predatory grace. "Explain the difference." "Well," the human's voice continued from the impenetrable blackness, sounding as if she were discussing weather patterns. "Real fear is personal and specific. This is showing you generalized anxiety about failure and death. It's like emotional theater rather than genuine terror." The manifestations in the darkness wavered, their edges becoming less distinct, as if the fortress itself was reconsidering its approach. "The psychology is fascinating," the human continued, and now her voice seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. "Whoever designed this system understood that most military minds are trained to expect certain categories of threat, so they provide exactly those threats, which creates a feedback loop of escalating panic." Captain Mordek's mandibles clicked in patterns that indicated dawning comprehension. "But if you don't expect those categories, then you see the system for what it actually is, a very sophisticated personality test." The human's voice was definitely coming from behind them now, though none of them had seen her emerge from the dark passage. "And I think we just passed the first section." They turned to find her standing beside the fountain of liquid light, completely unharmed and apparently unaffected by her journey through impossible darkness. In her hands was an object that seemed to shift between crystal and metal, its surface covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "What is that?" Fleet Admiral Zarketh's voice demanded through their comm systems. The human held up the object, studying its surface with the casual interest of someone examining an unusual seashell. I think it's a key, or maybe an invitation. The translation is a bit ambiguous. She looked up at her bewildered teammates with an expression of patient expectation. So, who wants to try the Bright Passage next? I have a feeling it's going to ask some very interesting questions about what we really want. The golden glow from the right-hand passage suddenly seemed less welcoming and more ominous, as if it had been listening to their conversation and found their presumptions amusing. The central chamber defied description in any language developed by military strategists or weapons designers. It wasn't a command center or an armory, or even a traditional throne room. Instead, it resembled something between a library and a garden, with living walls that pulsed gently with bioluminescent patterns and floating crystalline displays that showed star charts spanning the entire galaxy. By every tactical manual ever written, Commander Vexthul breathed, his forearms hanging uselessly at his sides as he stared at what was obviously not a weapons cache. This should not exist. The human walked calmly to the center of the chamber, where a pedestal rose from the organic floor like a flower reaching toward artificial suns. Resting on its surface was a sphere of impossible complexity. Part crystal, part living tissue, part pure energy contained in geometric patterns that seemed to fold through dimensions. "It's a governance matrix," she announced, as if identifying a particularly interesting species of houseplant. Basically, the administrative controls for an entire sector's defensive network, not the weapons themselves, just the authority to direct them. General Thisara's serpentine form coiled in configurations that spoke of barely controlled panic. "You cannot possibly know that." The human gestured toward symbols that had begun appearing on the chamber walls, flowing script that shifted between languages faster than any translation software could process. "It's been explaining itself since we arrived. The fortress isn't hiding anything. It's been trying to give us a comprehensive briefing." Lieutenant Korvash's 6 eyes tracked the flowing text with desperate precision, her advanced optical systems struggling to maintain focus on words that seemed to rewrite themselves mid-sentence. "The linguistic patterns they're adaptive, responding to our cognitive frameworks in real time." "Exactly." The human reached into her bag and produced what appeared to be a thermos of coffee, steam rising from its opened top, despite the fact that she had packed it hours ago on a different planet. "Want some?" "It helps with processing complex information." Captain Mordek accepted the offered cup with the automatic politeness of a career soldier, then paused as the warm liquid somehow made the incomprehensible symbols begin resolving into meaning. This describes the original construction protocols. The fortress was never built as a military installation. "It was built as a test," the human confirmed, settling cross-legged on the chamber floor with the casual comfort of someone attending a particularly interesting lecture. "A screening system designed to identify individuals capable of responsible governance during crisis situations." Fleet Admiral Zarketh's voice crackled through their comm systems with undertones of crystalline stress fractures. "Explain the parameters of this test." The human took a sip of her impossibly warm coffee and watched as the chamber's displays began showing historical records. Images of the 47 previous military expeditions, each one ending in psychological breakdown and tactical failure. Simple, really. It was looking for someone who could walk into an unknown situation and focus on keeping everyone alive and functional rather than on achieving military objectives. Commander Vexthul's weapons systems powered down with soft mechanical sighs as his targeting computers finally accepted that there was nothing here to destroy. Theos, psychological warfare. the terror-inducing defenses, were responses to what it perceived as threats, the human finished gently. Military minds approach unknown situations by identifying enemies and planning attacks. The fortress interpreted that as hostile intent and defended itself accordingly. The chamber's walls began displaying new information, not star charts or technical specifications, but psychological profiles. Each member of their team was represented by flowing patterns of light that somehow conveyed personality traits and cognitive tendencies with crystalline clarity. "It's been analyzing us since we entered," General Thisara realized, her coils shifting into patterns that indicated dawning comprehension rather than preparation for violence. "Actually, since before we entered," the human corrected. "The entire approach sequence was part of the evaluation process. How we moved across the terrain, how we responded to the absence of expected threats, how we dealt with architectural impossibilities." Lieutenant Korvash's invisibility systems flickered and finally deactivated entirely as she processed the implications. The other teams, they failed because they approached this as a military operation. Right. They came here expecting to fight, so the fortress gave them something to fight. Unfortunately, what it gave them was their own escalating panic reflected back at them until they couldn't distinguish between external threats and internal fears. The human offered her thermos to General Thisara, who accepted it with movements that suggested she was reassessing everything she thought she understood about tactical operations. The governance matrix began to pulse with gentle rhythms that somehow conveyed invitation rather than warning. Around it, holographic interfaces materialized, not weapon control systems, but administrative frameworks for managing resources, coordinating relief efforts, and facilitating communication between dozens of different species and political entities. "It's offering command authority," Captain Mordek realized, his mandibles clicking in patterns that indicated profound confusion. "To us, to this team." "Not to the team," the human corrected, standing and approaching the matrix with the same calm confidence she had shown throughout their entire impossible mission. "To whoever demonstrates the cognitive flexibility to understand what responsible governance actually requires." Commander Vexthul's 4 arms gestured in sequences that would have been threatening if they weren't so obviously bewildered. "You're suggesting that our military credentials are somehow insufficient?" The human smiled with genuine warmth rather than condescension. "I'm suggesting that the skills required to destroy things are fundamentally different from the skills required to keep things running smoothly." She placed her hands on the governance matrix, and the entire chamber filled with harmonious resonances as the sphere accepted her authority. "Primary governance recognition complete," announced a voice that seemed to come from the fortress itself, warm, ancient, and profoundly relieved. "Administrative controls transferring to designated coordinator. Welcome, Logistics Specialist Chen. We have been waiting quite some time for someone who understood that leadership is primarily about making sure everyone has what they need to do their jobs effectively." The elite warriors stood in stunned silence as their consultant became the administrative authority for defensive systems spanning 17 star systems. Around them, the chamber's displays shifted to show supply chains, resource allocation matrices, and communication networks that could coordinate the activities of billions of sentient beings. "Chen," General Thisara said slowly, testing the unfamiliar human designation. "Your actual title? We never asked." The human, Chen, began examining the administrative interfaces with the focused attention of someone who had finally found equipment she recognized. "Senior Logistics Coordinator, Humanitarian Aid Division, Earth Colonial Administration, specialized in crisis resource management and interspecies psychological compatibility assessment." Lieutenant Korvash's 6 eyes performed independent focus adjustments as she processed this information. You're not military personnel at all. Never claimed to be. Chen activated what appeared to be a supply requisition system and began entering data with practiced efficiency. Although I did spend 15 years managing food distribution during the Centauri refugee crisis, which taught me quite a bit about keeping large groups of diverse beings functional under stress. The governance matrix pulsed with increasing brightness as Chen's administrative commands propagated through the network. Status displays throughout the chamber showed defensive systems across 17 star systems, shifting from automated alert status to coordinated readiness. Not preparing for war, but preparing to provide whatever support their respective populations might need. Fleet Admiral Zarketh's voice carried undertones of what might have been admiration, mixed with profound embarrassment. The mission briefing. Command new. Command suspected, Chen corrected, now juggling multiple holographic interfaces with the same casual competence she had shown when distributing snacks. They'd analyzed 47 failures and reached the obvious conclusion. This wasn't a military problem requiring a military solution. Commander Vex Thule slowly holstered weapons that had never been necessary in the first place. So they sent someone whose primary qualification was keeping people fed, hydrated, and psychologically stable while they figured out how to solve complicated problems. Chen paused in her administrative work to offer him a granola bar from her apparently inexhaustible supply. Turns out that's exactly what responsible governance looks like, especially during crises. The chamber filled with a gentle chiming sound as the governance matrix completed its integration with Chen's cognitive patterns. Around them, the fortress began transforming, walls becoming transparent to reveal gardens and workshops where the original builders had created their psychological masterpiece, corridors reshaping themselves into comfortable meeting spaces designed for diplomatic conferences rather than military briefings. There's one thing I don't understand, Captain Mordek admitted, accepting his own granola bar with the bemused expression of someone whose worldview had been comprehensively reconstructed. Why maintain the illusion? Why let us believe this was a military operation? Chen settled back into her cross-legged position, now surrounded by holographic displays showing the peaceful coordination of defensive networks that had been designed not to wage war, but to prevent it through competent administration and resource sharing. Because, she said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to very intelligent people who had missed the point entirely. The best way to identify someone capable of responsible leadership during a crisis is to put them in a crisis and see if they remember that their job is to take care of everyone else, not to prove how dangerous they are. The fortress chimed again, a sound like crystal bells celebrating the end of a very long wait. Outside, alien suns began setting over landscape that no longer looked hostile, but merely unfamiliar, the kind of unfamiliarity that invited exploration rather than conquest. In the distance, their extraction ship received clearance to land not as a military evacuation vehicle, but as the first diplomatic transport to a world that had finally found someone who understood that true strength was measured not by the ability to destroy, but by the wisdom to build something better instead. Chen checked her watch. The same primitive timepiece that had seemed so out of place in a room full of galactic military technology, and began packing up her thermos. We should head back, she announced practically. I still need to file the administrative paperwork for this operation, and bureaucracy waits for no one. The elite warriors followed her toward the exit, each lost in private contemplation of how thoroughly they had misunderstood both their mission and their universe. Behind them, the governance matrix pulsed with steady rhythms that somehow suggested quiet satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of victory, but the deeper contentment that came from finally being understood by someone who knew that the most important battles were won not with weapons, but with properly organized supply chains and a genuine commitment to making sure everyone got home safely. It was, Chen reflected as they walked back through corridors that now felt welcoming rather than ominous, exactly the kind of outcome you could expect when you sent someone whose greatest tactical advantage was remembering to pack extra snacks for a team that had forgotten they were more than just very expensive weapons pointed at problems that couldn't be solved by pointing weapons at them.